Hi everyone, I am Matt Welch. I'm the editor-in-chief of Reason magazine, which some of you read. And welcome here. Thank you for coming through all of the horrific heat outside. We have a very special night ahead of us. We're going to have an hour-long conversation with the great David Stockman, author of The Great Deformation, The Corruption of Capitalism in America. He is a human sort of myth-busting machine, disrupting narratives and making people call him things like spittle-flecked, angry old man on the New York Times editorial pages. Before we get too much into it, round of applause for the man, if you would. Before we get started, a couple of programming notes. First of all, we're going to do this for an hour. The first half hour or so will be me asking questions. The second half hour will be the smart questions, which will come from all of you, particularly those who have expertise in the fields which are under discussion. And as a reminder of all of that, of course, questions are welcome, speeches are a little bit less welcome. We will be taping this, and are taping this even right now as we speak, on Reason TV, which means that if you don't want to be on TV, don't do anything weird, and don't ask a question. Also there are books, this book here, except in better, without the coffee stains, available for free outside. You can grab one, and if you're super nice to David Stockman, he might even sign it or write exactly when he thinks the entire financial system is going to collapse. And then beyond that, this whole night would not have been made possible if it wasn't for the extreme generosity of the Smith Family Foundation. Don Smith, where are you? Thank you very much. Okay. David Stockman first ran for Congress and won a seat in 1976 at the age of 30 or so. He is famously Ronald Reagan's boy wonder budget director from 1981. He quit in a huff in 85 or so, and went to Salomon Brothers, which I think that means you're at the scene of a lot of crimes throughout modern financial history. He also went to Blackstone Group. After TARP and the great financial freakout of 2008, started getting heavily into the news cycle with very counterintuitive criticisms of how Washington kind of bipartisan bailout economics have ensued, and what that means for the future and what that means for the 100 years or so that led up to this moment, culminating in the Great Deformation, which is a rip-roaring and very entertaining read. Before we delve into the book a little bit, since we have you here and there's news in Wall Street, Ben Bernanke made a lot of headlines last week talking about tapering off the bond buyback program. Everybody's freaking out. Can you, just for the sake of this audience here, what's your take on that? Where does that fit into your overall kind of thesis about Federal Reserve policy at large?
Well, if you want me to explain what he's doing, I don't have the slightest idea. But I'm not alone in that, because he doesn't either. I do want to say a couple of things before I try to answer that question directly, including the fact that, yes, my career did involve being present at the scene of many crimes. And one of them occurred in 1976 when I was elected to Congress at age 29. And I had two other 29-year-old hotshots who were elected with me. On the one side was Dan Quayle, and the other side was Al Gore. So you can see where the crime started there. I do appreciate, Matt, before we get into the Fed and all the issues, that you had some nice things to say about my book. It's been out 2 months now, and so far it's been denounced by the right and the left and Republicans and Democrats and Keynesians and monitors and supply-siders. And that's just the beginning, and also Wall Street and K Street and the military-industrial complex, as well as the neocons, the social cons, and the just cons, which is about everybody else in Washington, as I think most of you know. Now, I'm not complaining about that. The reaction has been fair enough because the book does call out crony capitalism for what it is. And I basically say that what we have today is a perversion of free markets, and what we have today is a system that is putting basic political democracy, as we had been led to understand it in school, very much at risk. So I expected a lot of brickbats, a lot of negative reaction. But frankly, I think some of the critics went over the top, and particularly Professor Paul Krugman, who, as many of you know, is the self-anointed and self-appointed authority on all matters of economics in terms of what's correct and not correct. And I really thought it was unfair that he went over the top when he called my book The Ravings of a Cranky Old Man. Even that aroused even my 85-year-old mother, who upon reading his blog, which had the imprimatur of the New York Times, entitled actually Cranky Old Man, immediately shot me back an email saying, doesn't he know you were actually a cranky young man too? You never got over it. But I think there must be a lot of cranky people in America, and this is the reason I'm bringing all this up, who are cranky about the way things are going, about the kind of outrageously bad policy that we're getting out of Washington and the Fed and a lot of other places, because the day he put out his Cranky Old Man blog, my book shot to the very top of the Amazon list. And there were only two things, two diet books that stopped it, and another thing called The Walking Dead, which I'm led to believe is some kind of novel horror story. In any event, I was pleased that that happened, and I say this in a very humble way, really, not a boastful way. But as a result of that, the first week that it was out in early April, it shot in week 1 to number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list. And the reason that I'm not boasting is that they're still having a debate at the New York Times about whether that would be number 4 on the fiction or the nonfiction list. And it seems like there's a lot of Keynesian economists who would like to dismiss the whole thing as fiction. So, getting to fiction, we had fiction last week when Bernanke said that he was going to taper, and when you put this in historic context, which is really what my book tries to do, it's kind of a 100-year revisionist history, when he says that he was tapering, or might think about soon or sometime down the road, taper the $85 billion a month of purchases by the Fed in the debt markets, $40 billion of which was GSEs, mortgage-backed securities, government guaranteed, the rest being treasury paper. This would have caused Carter Glass, the author of the Fed, in 1913, exactly 100 years ago today, to be rolling in his grave. And I think it's kind of is symptomatic. It triggers the whole discussion about where we are, why we have crony capitalism, why the free market is failing, why government is out of control, why our financial system is heading for some kind of crack-up not too far down the road. Because if you compare what Bernanke was saying last week to the model, to the design that Carter Glass, and many of you know him from Glass-Steagall, but the design that he had in mind when he was chairman of the Banking Committee and adopted the Fed legislation in 1913, it's really mind-boggling to consider the facts. Number one, the Fed, as he designed it, and Carter Glass was, I think, one of the great financial statesmen of the 20th century, the Fed could not buy government bonds. It was not even allowed to be near buying any kind of government paper, whether it was bills, notes, or bonds. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there weren't any government bonds to buy anyway. In 1913, the total debt of the United States was $1 billion, which amounted to $12 per capita, which even in today's badly depreciated currency is only $400 compared to the $55,000 per capita in today's dollars that we have. And more interestingly, the government debt outstanding, this minor 1.2 billion, 4%, or actually 3% of GDP, had not changed in nominal terms since the Battle of Gettysburg. Amazingly, between 1863 and 1913, 50 years, the nominal debt of the United States did not go up. We had small government, we had sound money, and also we had an economy that grew pretty well, notwithstanding what the Keynesians tell you today about the dystopia that allegedly existed in the late 19th century when we were having crash and busts and banking panics and so forth, according to Professor Krugman all the time. Actually, according to Christina Romer, who I guess is not some kind of nut job from the right, like I'm alleged to be, but she was the go-to student of the 19th century. Her studies show that between 1869 and 1913, real GDP grew at a compound rate of 3.7% a year for 40 years running. In other words, it was the strongest period of sustained economic growth, of general prosperity, of rising living standards in modern history. We've never replicated anything like that since, except for periods of war, and frankly, wars are not a good way to meet your Keynesian targets. Well, I go into this little historical digression because if you look at what Carter Glass had in mind in a world where there was no government debt, in a world where there were budget surpluses, not deficits, in which there was no bond market, and in which he, as the author, hated Wall Street and didn't want to have the Fed to have anything to do with it. That's why we have 12 Federal Reserve region banks in San Francisco, Boston, Dallas, and so forth. The idea was that the Fed would only be a banker's bank that would run a discount window in 12 locations when real commercial bankers brought good commercial paper, such as inventory paper or receivables, to the Fed for cash on a discounted basis at a penalty rate of interest above the free market rate. That was the Carter Glass design. There was no open market operation. There was no bond buying, not 85 billion, not 40 billion, not anything. There was no targeting of any economic variables. They weren't going to target, obviously, GDP, because frankly, they couldn't even measure it then. They weren't going to target unemployment or inflation or housing starts or industrial production or retail sales or any of the rest of it. Even M1 they were not going to target because they didn't know how to measure M1. My point is, it was a passive institution to provide liquidity to a banking system that served an industrial and business economy that would grow based on the interaction of producers and consumers and investors and speculators and the whole population of a free society and a free economy. The government didn't care what the GDP growth rate or the unemployment rate was or anything else. The Fed targeted nothing because the job of a discount window-based central bank was simply to provide liquidity to a banking system that responded to the ebb and flow of commerce. Now, I think it's important to revive what the original design was, to compare it to Bernanke last week trying to decide through, mumbo-jumbo words and word clouds whether he was tapering or not tapering in a market that is totally dominated by a central bank that rigs everything. Every price in the financial markets, whether it's a bill price or a note price or a bond price or a spread for MBS against the Treasury, or whether it's a risk asset price like the Russell 2000 and many others, all are basically managed, medicated, and rigged by an overwhelming dominant central bank today that I call a national monetary planning system, the opposite of a free economy. And I bring all this together here because it says in 100 years we've drifted to something that worked, to something that today is essentially economic totalitarianism, if you really want to boil it down to a phrase. Now, the reason I've said this is that a lot of things happened along the way over 100 years to get us from Carter Glass's banker's bank passive discount window to this kind of monetary politburo of 12 people that run the financial system of the United States and the world today out of the Eccles building. But that takes you 730 pages to get through all the steps along the way, and hopefully that's really what I was addressing in the book, and that tonight we can get into some of the crucial, turning points, inflection points that happened that got us from Carter Glass, fathering the Federal Reserve in 1913 to Bernanke emitting word clouds last week about tapering or not tapering in a central bank dominated economy.
Well, let's talk about the inflection point that you begin the book with, which is basically the fall of 2008.
Right.
You make the provocative claim. Actually, I'd kind of be curious to see how many people in this audience agree with the claim that in September of 2008, fall of 2008, there was no risk of financial contagion. It's complete fiction, according to David Stockman. How many believe that, by the way? How many don't believe that, by the way? All right. And how many people work here in the financial industry? Just to kind of like...
And how many are in both categories?
So talk about this. You go point by point. AIG, insurance company, wasn't at a risk of contagion. Debunk this myth for these skeptics in this audience.
Okay. I think the first point is I call it the Blackberry Panic of 2008. Because I believed it happened in a few days around about the time of the Lehman failure, when policy was dominated by a bunch of people on the third floor of the Treasury building in Washington that I call the occupiers. I mean, actually the bailouts and TARP and all the bad things that came out of that particular moment in time, just a few days, was due to the occupiers. But the occupiers were Goldman Sachs. That's that's the different slant on it. But essentially, Hank Paulson, was looking at his BlackBerry, and he could see the price of the S&P dropping by the hour. He could see the price of Goldman Sachs, which had peaked, I think, way up at 350 a few years after the IPO, cutting under 100, heading towards 65, and bottoming for a couple of panic moments there at about 48, I think it was. And it was looking at those blinking red numbers on his BlackBerry that induced him into a totally frenzied state of mind that quickly spread to the rest of the government because the rest of the government was clueless. And they took his word for it because he's a Wall Street man. I mean, obviously George Bush was clueless. The Congress was totally buffaloed. We know what happened when they were brought up to the Hill and he got down on his knees and begged Nancy Pelosi. That tells you that the whole system was clueless at that point in time. But what I'm saying is, if you look at it carefully, you had a unique historical interception, and I'm pretty much a determinist. I think big forces drive history. But I think in the context of big forces, you had two personalities that created a massive panic based on either a self-interested, biased perception or vast misunderstanding. The other personality was Bernanke. He claims to be a scholar of the Great Depression. I dispute it heatedly. I think he is a math modeler who unfortunately Xeroxed Milton Friedman's erroneous view of what the Fed did in 1930, 31, and 32. And on the basis of that alleged authority, which was taken for granted, not really debated, examined, or understood in Washington, he suddenly said, Great Depression 2.0 is around the corner. We're facing a monster. All the rules get thrown out. We're going to have to do massive incomprehensible things in terms of all of the rules about fiscal rectitude and market responsibility for mistakes and bad trades and so forth. And they believed him, and the two of them put Washington into a panic, tried to pass you know, I mean, I was in the fiscal process, and I can just tell you the feel of a $700 billion blank check in a system that normally debates and massages stuff for months and months and years, in itself was kind of a panic-inducing moment. And so when suddenly this alleged scholar of the Great Depression and this other guy who's watching his Blackberry and has a attention span of a few hours at best declare that we're heading for a massive economic meltdown of historic proportions, it then spread around the system. And out of that, people began to believe all kinds of things based on casual, ad hoc, self-serving arguments that they made up by the seat of their pants that weren't true. And in my book, for about 70 pages worth, I go through it. I won't go into all of them now, but let me mention 4 quickly. One, after Lehman failed, the next day they reversed course and said they had to bail out AIG. The idea that AIG was some kind of economic contagion that was going to spread globally simply because it was so big and its balance sheet was $800 billion is one of the greatest urban legends of modern times. Because the problem at AIG was the holding company only. It was actually run out of London, as many of you know. It was the agency that had sold all of the CDS, credit default swaps, to the 10 or 20 largest banks in the world, based on the balance sheet of consolidated AIG, which had plenty of capital, plenty of equity, except the problem for all the smart guys at Soc Gen and Citibank and JP Morgan and the rest of them who bought the CDS from the holding company was they never asked about the liquidity question. That is, could all of the capital and the equity that was buried in dozens of AIG insurance companies, the P&L, property and casualty operations, retirement annuity operations, life insurance companies, and so forth, there were dozens of them that added up to this consolidated balance sheet. Could the holding company at will extract capital in unlimited amounts or cash in unlimited amounts so that it would then sell this stuff into the market, create a downward contagion in order to meet the margin calls that it was getting on the credit default swaps as the subprime market unwound drastically in mid-September. Now, the truth of the matter is that all of those insurance companies had dividend stoppers. They were regulated by state insurance commissions, for better or worse. It was there. The holding company could not extract any meaningful cash or capital from any of these dozens of subsidiaries that had good assets. And so therefore there was never going to be any contagion selling. There was never going to be any meltdown because the insurance commissioners would have seized the subsidiaries if AIG had gone into bankruptcy as the other alternative. So essentially what you had then was no liquidity in the holding company and about 20 big banks in the world that had foolishly bought credit default insurance so they could own subprime mortgage-backed securities, book the high yield, and not have to book any profit or any capital, as you know, because if you had CDS, AAA CDS from AIG under the rules of Basel rules, you didn't need to post any capital. So they didn't have to put up any capital. They were collecting the spread. They were paying almost nothing for the insurance. This was a small catastrophe that would have caused the 20 biggest banks of the world, New York, London, and Paris, to lose about $60 billion. I've sort of calculated it through. It's not my numbers. It came from the Crisis Inquiry Commission of Congress. But the $60 billion amounts to 1/2 of the combined balance sheet of these huge banks that had 20 trillion of footings between them. In other words, it would have caused a few quarters worth of losses. It would have caused some stock options and bonuses not to be awarded in 2008. It wouldn't have caused any of these great institutions, Barclays or BNP Paribas or SocGen or Citibank, to go down, because in Europe the socialist governments would have backed them up anyway, and in the United States they could have put it, if they had to, into resolution by the FDIC. Now, the reason I go through this is that it was the image of AIG that until then, and some of you are in the financial markets, others aren't, but if you were in the financial world from the 90s and through the up through the great crisis of 2008, AIG had a powerful, emotive, symbolic meaning. AIG was the gold standard of finance. And that's how people had grown up. That's what they thought. AIG was the miracle place that had an $800 billion balance sheet. And when suddenly AIG in one day was going to go down the tubes and take the world with it and needed $180 billion of totally inconceivable bailout, capital and cash from the government, that's what started everybody down. It opened a new chapter. It put everybody in a frame of mind that there was some, comet from outer space that had suddenly arrived in the financial markets with some deadly contagions that were going to take everything down. So it was the AIG mistake that happened in a couple of days, because you know why? Paulson was running around with his hair on fire, that part of it which he still had, served by a bunch of young guys who had been M&A bankers at Goldman Sachs, who knew nothing about insurance, who had no facts about the true situation of AIG, and they simply railroaded and panicked everyone into this 1-2 day massive move on AIG. Well, once you did that, well then pretty soon everything else starts to line up, and you get panic calls from Jeff Immelt, the head of GE, saying, oh gee, my commercial paper rate's gone from 2 to 6%, I don't like that. And the next thing you know, while they were at it, they bailed out, they nationalized the commercial paper market, didn't need to be done. There was this whole thing about the money market funds were going down the drain. I'll shorten this up by saying, I go through it. There were 3.8 trillion of money market funds outstanding. Half of them were basically called prime funds, which means mostly bank, government paper. It was good. They had a little commercial paper, and when Lehman went down, some of the prime funds got hit. The other half, 1.8 trillion, was government-only funds, and there was never $1 of withdrawal of panic run on the 1.8 trillion. Now, the truth of the matter is, notwithstanding what Bernanke kept telling congressional committees and Paulson and all the rest of them, if you look at the data, which comes from the Investment Institute, so it's not, again, numbers I'm making up, out of that whole 3.8 trillion, 400 billion moved through the push of a button by most investors who had their accounts at big fund companies that did both kinds. They moved 400 billion roughly from the prime funds to the government-only funds. That's what happened. I mean, it didn't go into mattresses. It didn't go down a black hole. There wasn't any kind of huge run on the money market funds going on. And of the entire amount, less than 60 billion actually left the money market fund families. It simply moved from column A to column B. The 60 billion that actually left is a couple percent. It wasn't the end of the world, and most of it went into bank paper anyway. So you could go through all the rest of it. Should we have bailed out Goldman Sachs? Of course not. If Goldman Sachs had met its maker in Chapter 11, there would have been 11 sons of Goldman that would have been reconstituted out of it, and that would be run by people today who are far more prudent, because they would have had to suffer the consequences of losing the value of their stock. There wasn't any retail bank run going on in America other than Washington Mutual, which was basically a Wall Street creation anyway. But if you look at retail banks in America, and I go through this in the book, 12 trillion of assets, the amount of toxic assets in retail Main Street banking, not Wall Street hedge funds that were otherwise known as investment banks. There was not any risk of the whole thing coming unwound, of lines at the teller windows and all the rest. Finally, there was no Great Depression 2.0 anywhere in sight, and I have quite an analysis in the book to show how Bernanke had it upside down. The Great Depression in 1930 happened because we were a huge exporter and creditor to the world, and when the world economy collapsed, our export economy collapsed and it spread to the rest of the system. In 2008, we were a massive importer. We were a huge debtor to the world. Obviously, we know all that. And so when the world economy went down as a result of the panic in September, the Hoovervilles were in the interior of China. They weren't in Pittsburgh, and they weren't in Detroit and Chicago and St. Louis and other places where it happened in 1930. Well, you can go through a lot of analysis of the structure of the economy. We now had a safety net, we had unemployment insurance, we had food stamps, we had many things that cushioned the downward flow of spending as a result of a minor amount of income dislocation that occurred. But it isn't remotely comparable or describable as Great Depression 2.0. So to sum it up, if AIG isn't a contagion that's going to wreck the planet, if the money market funds were not going into some giant meltdown, if you go through the commercial paper market, whatever they were saying about ATMs going dark and so forth is not remotely true. If GE, a AAA credit, could not fund a few billion of commercial paper, if you consider the fact that there was no bank runs that were going to happen or Great Depression that was going to happen, then what happened in September and October 2008 was a drastic, horrendous historical mistake. It was a Rubicon because it was done by a Republican White House, and it was done by a Republican Congress and administration. And so if they're going to throw out all the rules of free markets, if they're going to throw fiscal rectitude to the winds, passing a $700 billion TARP, if they're going to basically say that markets don't work and therefore anything that's big and interactive, interconnected, can't be allowed to fail, that is financial institutions, when it makes mistakes, if you're going to predicate all of that, which is what the Bush White House did, and the Paulson, and I really say it was a coup d'etat. Paulson was running the government. It was a coup d'etat by Paulson and the Goldman people running around the third floor. When all of that happens, you can't go back to Kansas anymore. It's gone. Free markets are gone. Fiscal management is gone. Any kind of even pragmatic notion of central bank prudence is gone after Bernanke increased the balance sheet of the Fed, and this is a startling fact, and then I'll wind up with this. Bernanke increased the balance sheet of the Fed between Lehman, September 15, and October 27, that's roughly 7 weeks, by $900 billion in 7 weeks, which means he was expanding the balance sheet at $700 million an hour, each and every hour during that interval. The reason I bring it up is because the first $900 billion of the balance sheet of the Fed had taken 94 years to produce. In other words, starting with Carter Glass and going through good times and bad times and good chairmen, like William McChesney Martin, and awful ones like Arthur Burns, through the entire first 94 years of the Fed's history, that's how long it took to get $900 billion of balance sheet. Bernanke replicated it in 7 weeks of panic. And then he tripled it in about 15 weeks through the end of December. That got it to 2.3 trillion, and now you know where it is today, 3.4 trillion. And even if they start to taper, if they can figure out what they're doing, we're going to end up in the $4 to $5 trillion range. So this is a central bank that is, a rogue institution run by hopeless Keynesian academic zealots who don't even understand that interest rates are the price of money, and they're not smart enough, those 12 geniuses on the Fed, to figure out the entire capital market of the world and how everything that moves back and forth by the nanosecond ought to be priced. But that's what they're doing today. It is a mission meant to blow up, explode, create a massive dislocation and failure. And it's only a matter of time. And the good news is that Bernanke is going back to Princeton in a few months. The bad news is that Yellen is worse. So if any of you have any hope, don't, because it's not merited.
September 24th, 2008, which is a day I'll always remember because I think it was the only time I was in the green room of the Rachel Maddow show, getting ready to talk about John McCain. And I was watching the George W. Bush go on national television. He had this great formulation. And I really encourage everyone to go and read that speech, by the way, of all the stuff that he warned that would happen to America if we didn't pass TARP right away, because he ticked off a list. You know, a lot of regional banks are going to go under, unemployment might go north of 9%. Everything that he warned that would happen if we didn't pass TARP happened after we passed TARP. But he had this great formulation of, normally I'm a great believer in free markets, but I presume it's your contention that normally he wasn't a great believer in free markets. And can you talk about how Republican conservative economics departed from a better place, and particularly what you observed at the scene of one of those crimes in the early 1980s? What were some of the crucial mistakes made that led to a mindset that was so ready to accept this different type of solution in 2008?
Okay, that's a great question. And just to clarify the quote, kind of the money quote, Bush actually said, "I am abandoning the rules of the free market in order to save the free market." Good for him. Yes. But it had been happening for a long time incrementally. During my period in the White House, I learned a few things about how much Republicans really believed in free markets. And one of them that's highlighted in the book, and I think it's important, is that I basically tried to kill Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the cradle in 1981 when they were just getting going. Of course, they had been around. You know, Fannie Mae was created during the Great Depression, '38, by the New Deal. But they had kind of bounced along of moderate size with a moderate role in the housing market through 1980. And my idea was that they were essentially using the credit of the United States in order to guarantee paper. That's all they did. There's nothing behind the facade of those buildings except you know, a printing press that would stamp guaranteed. And they were not charging the market the value of using the credit of the United States. So I came up with a simple thing that would have killed them off. A guarantee fee that would make the yield on the paper that they were guaranteeing rise to a market clearing level. Now, that would have killed them long ago, before they became huge in the early 90s and then monstrous by the late 90s, and then the kind of world destroyers that they became by 2007. But that effort was killed by the Republicans in the House on the House Banking Committee, because they said that housing is too important to be left to the free market, and therefore we need to have a continued role for Fannie and Freddie, you know, bolstering home ownership and making credit available on economic terms to people who deserve it. Now, it's interesting to say that, because so 1981 was an opportunity missed among many along the way. I bring it up because today, with a lot of fanfare, a Republican, Senator Corker, who's thought to be moderately conservative, introduces the Corker-Warner bill to reform the GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And guess what they're doing? They're going to take them out of existence and create a new program to insure mortgage-backed securities that are issued by the private sector. So we learn nothing. The Republican Party, never seems to understand what the free market is. We had a near-death experience with a total collapse of the housing market, with massive distortions, as we all know, going on that were ultimately, fueled and supported by Freddie and Fannie with $6 trillion balance sheets. They ultimately needed to be nationalized. And yet, here we are after all of that, near-death experience, and the leading Republican says, I'm going to recreate them with a new name, but it's still the same old game. Now, why in the world do we need to, why can't we leave housing to the free market? Why do we need to have interest rates that are 4.5% when maybe they would be 6.5%? On 30-year mortgages in the free market? Why do we need to have 65% home ownership rate, not 69% that we had at the peak, or 55%, which they have in Germany, and you could go on and on. Now the point is, if the Republicans, who are looking for an issue because they're lost out there somewhere, if they're looking for an issue and they're trying to capitalize on the legitimate fear that the American public had as a result of the great financial crisis experience, they can't even come up with an honest program to shut down the GSE monsters that have no place, no need for existence. They can't even come up with that. What else happened along the way? So many of them you don't want to hear about. The farm programs, we couldn't get rid of them. Still can't. Now, everybody says, well, isn't it nice they defeated the Farm Bill yesterday? But the point is, or 2 days ago, the Farm Bill was defeated by liberal Democrats who didn't want to reform by a tiny 1 or 2% the food stamp program. The rest of it was passed by Republicans who thought it would be just great to have, in this world that we're living in today, massively subsidized crop insurance so that farmers could go out and produce wheat, let's say, on arid lands when there seems to be weather patterns that interfere with the profitability of that. So my point is, you could go up and down the spectrum, and you can't see a lot of evidence of sound free market policy coming from Republicans where it could make a difference. And then ultimately, of course, the problem is the Fed. And it's rather interesting if you look at what Boehner said a couple days ago. He said the Fed is deflating the money too much or something. In other words, it was incomprehensible. I mean, it was, it was babble. Okay, and so if you have a monstrous threat to sound money and free markets, like the central bank today, run by a guy who was put on the central bank to run it by Karl Rove, then maybe you can put connect the dots and realize that there is no hope in the Republican Party. I have one little section in my book, but I like to bring it up because Karl Rove, I think, is the essence of everything that is wrong with what used to be the Conservative Party, the Republican Party in the United States. And in the early first Bush term, he had the wisdom to get Paul O'Neill fired because O'Neill said if you're going to have another war, you ought to pay for it out of taxes, which I firmly believe the way you stop the warfare state is to have people pay taxes, and then they'll find out whether they want to put pants on the natives, in Iraq and other places around the world. And he said, I'm going to fire O'Neill for the temerity to say that we have to raise taxes to finance the war, and I'm going to appoint Bernanke to the Fed first, and then as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors to the president second in 2005, and then third as a reward for that, make him chairman of the Fed, when anybody could have read the man's written lifetime work and see that he was a total Keynesian, statist, money printing, demand side, economist that should have not even been given the time of day by a Republican White House. But this has all happened in our time. You know, this isn't history, this isn't theory, this is reality. This is what Republicans do when they're in power. And so therefore, if Republicans do this, then how do we get out of this box? We certainly aren't going to look to the Democrats for salvation. So my bottom line is, until the party system goes through a massive realignment and the Republican Party breaks up and the warmongers and the neocons and the social cons and the people who want to run your private life go off in one direction, and people who have a sense of fiscal integrity and what real free market economics is about go off in another direction, there isn't really a lot of hope of getting out of this tangle that we're in today.
That's cheery. So where is our delicious inflation? We've been promised inflation by a lot of critics, trenchant critics of the Federal Reserve and money printing, and Ben Bernanke over the years. Where is it?
We have massive inflation. And but the inflation that is massive today is in financial asset prices, not in the cost of labor or in the consumer price index. And what the historic sound money people told you was that inflation can be in goods and services, or it can be in financial assets, but in either way it's a bad thing. That the great inflation of financial assets that we had in the 1920s eventually led to the collapse in 1929. And probably one of the most astute diagnoses of that financial asset inflation in the 20s, because there was no CPI change from 1919 to 1929, the guy who had diagnosed that brilliantly was none other than Alan Greenspan in 1966, who wrote a very penetrating and I think brilliant analysis of the issue of inflation, and that when you basically cause financial assets through money printing and manipulation of financial markets and the puts that developed and so forth to soar in value, you're creating the same kind of distortions in a roundabout way or one step removed that happen with goods inflation. Now, as long as we have a central bank system that's worldwide, I call it a convoy of monetary roach motels. That's what the central banks are, because they all buy the bond. The bond comes in, it never goes out. Much of the sovereign debt of the world today is in the central banks. They're all inflating their systems, and as a result of that, in the short run, it's bringing massive capacity into the world economy. By that I mean massive expansion of mining capacity for copper or aluminum or iron ore or nickel or any of the rest of it. Massive expansion of capacity for factory production by draining the rice paddies and bringing the peasants into the world economy. So the effect of central bank inflation is to create a world boom that causes capacity to expand rapidly due to malinvestment, overinvestment, misinvestment. All of that capacity, both the China price on labor and the massive capacity to produce manufactured and industrial supplies, keeps the CPI down, and it causes, obviously, the excess liquidity that's being created to flow into financial assets. So that's why we get serial bubbles, from .com to the housing bubble to the credit bubble, and now we're back to the same thing. Today the stock market actually closed, the S&P 500, only about 1.5% above where it was in October 9, 2007. And when it closed at that peak in October 2007, before the last collapse of a bubble, it was only slightly higher than where it had been in March 2000. So I think the pattern is that the modern central banking, what I call it fiat central banking, creates financial asset inflation, periodic bubbles that finally reach an unsustainable level. They collapse on their own weight as soon as confidence is disrupted for one unexpected reason or another, some kind of black swan or unexpected event, like let's say Lehman. And then they collapse and they create all kind of carnage, obviously, in their wake. So the inflation is here. It's right in front of your eyes. It's all over the world. It's massively overvalued real estate, commodities, financial assets of every type. The Fed resolutely ignores and denies that. And as a result, they have a policy which is extremely dangerous in my view, which says as long as we don't get CPI inflation, which by definition you can't get when you're inflating a global industrial economy, and you're still one peasant left in the rice paddies. If we can print money as much as we want, we can expand our balance sheet with unlimited scope as long as we don't get CPI inflation. And meanwhile, we get bubble after bubble, every kind of distortion known to man, huge trading windfalls, massive rent seeking in all of these hyper-activated gambling markets. All of this, one, is bad for the real economy and for real prosperity and real living standards. But second, it gives capitalism a bad name. Sooner or later, the people are going to get out their pitchforks, they're going to get out their torches, and they're going to come after the 1%. Because the 1% today are reaping these huge windfalls, whether it's on junk bonds or real estate or some godforsaken Fannie Mae preferreds that they bought for 1 cent on the dollar. They're making these massive windfalls due to central bank policy, not due to economic value creation. And it's only a matter of time before the people get a little tired about this and we get some real populism. Then if you think, we have problems with the way we're running our fiscal accounts or running, our market process, we're only in a warm-up phase.
I want to make sure that we have enough time for audience questions. How are we doing on time here? Some people to watch. Lightning round. You, in your opening, include a list of villains and a list of heroes. Villains include Milton Friedman. Heroes include Bill Clinton. 30 seconds.
It would take me more than 30 seconds to explain that one, I'll tell you. No, the 30-second answer is Clinton balanced the budget. I really have concluded after a lifetime in this that there is a fundamental issue of between starve the beast or pay your bills. That's a fundamental question. And I've come to the conclusion that starve the beast is a terrible thing because it gives the people big government without the yoke and burden of taxes to pay for it. And as a result of that, the politicians just build up the debt on the future and the people don't feel the pain today. Under the rule of pay your bills, which is what the old Republican orthodoxy was and what Eisenhower, and that's why he's a hero, by the way, in my book, actually implemented in the 50s. By paying your bills, the people feel the pain of the size of government that the politicians are creating. And it's only when they feel the pain, and not just the 2% or the 1% or somebody you're going to hit with a surtax, but the whole middle class productive economy. When they feel the pain, then there is a fair fight in the political arena between the cost and the benefits, the trade-offs, and how you pay for something as opposed to what you're getting. So that's why I provocatively picked Bill Clinton, because I don't think on economic policy he was all that brilliant or virtuous, but he did resist the left. He did say, as the surplus was coming in from Greenspan's bubble of the 90s, that we're going to use this to balance the budget and actually run some minor surpluses. And I give him credit for that. because it established the rule of pay your bills. And that's why in my book I call for a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, because without it we're just going to bury the future in debt one way or another.
You also call for a wealth tax, and in general, as you said before, to pay as we go. If we taxed ourselves to the level that we spent, would we not be in Ben Bernanke's Great Depression 2.0?
If we taxed ourselves at the level we spent, after a period of adjustment, we would have less growth, we would have less efficiency, we would have less incentives, we would have less entrepreneurial energy, we would have many lesser things. We would have many bad things. And then the people might begin to see that that's the cost of government. And if you want to have this massive, all-encompassing welfare state, then you're going to have a fairly, frugal existence, ascetic existence. But I think that's what you need to do. And the Republicans have made the mistake of saying, we know how to grow the economy through the instrumentalities of the state, but they choose to use the tax code to stimulate this and boost that and encourage the other thing. And they're playing the Keynesian game from the tax side. And I think that's not the right way to go. If you want to have big government and pay the full taxes and have a no-growth economy, then the people can decide to do that. If rather the libertarian view of the world is more attractive and we can get more economic growth, then do that, or something in between.
On that note, I think we will wrap it up. A reminder to clap. Thank you very much. This book, in better form, is out there. It's for you. Thanks again, David Stockman and everybody else.